In the words of Isaiah this morning, we hear the promise of healing, tremendous healing. And in the words of Jesus reassuring John the Baptist, who is in prison, we hear that healing is indeed a sign of kingdom nearness. God's way, the desire of God's heart for all of creation, is shalom, wholeness, mind, body, and spirit. This morning, on this third Sunday of Advent, the third Sunday of the Church New Year, we are invited to a bold New Year's intention, resolution, to be part of bringing that healing into the world. I am grateful for the grace that this church has given me in my life journey with God. I know we do this for one another. We support our growing edges, the places of healing with one another, by encouraging, by listening, by allowing space, being with one another in times of need, praying together, encouraging each other to trust God together, who is always doing a new thing in our individual lives and in our lives together. You all have allowed me and have encouraged me along the way, many different ways, all of those above. And you've also allowed me to pursue studies at the seminary. Recently, I've been traveling to Pennsylvania 3 times this fall to do further study in Gestalt pastoral care with a woman named Tilda Norberg, who's now a Methodist minister and the founder of this Gestalt pastoral care. So this morning I'd like to share with you a few stories. I'd like to begin with a story of Tilda and her own life journey, and then use one of her books called Stretch Out Your Hand that she wrote with Robert Weber that explores very specifically healing prayer and what that might look like. Tilda's story really begins when she was 16. Most of her childhood was spent with her folks in Alabama, and then for a job, her dad moved them up to Saginaw. I believe that's right. I got it mixed up with Saugatuck. Saginaw, Michigan, where he worked, I think, for one of the big auto companies. So her folks were flying back into town, and she and her sister were there at the airport to meet them. She was 16. And when the plane that was carrying her parents landed, it burst into flame, and she watched both of her parents die in front of her at the airport. I think it was a regional airport because some people ran out, well, maybe this was when you could still do that, ran out onto the tarmac, and in the screaming and the chaos, she had an experience of Jesus. She remembers seeing Jesus very, very clearly, in a physical kind of way. And 7 times he reassured her, "Don't worry, I will be with you." And then she returned to the chaos, the screaming, the scrambling around her. And she and her sister then faced the reality of life without their parents. She was helped to grow up by an aunt, and family came around her. And in college, she felt a strong call to go to seminary. So in 1966, she was one of 3 women that graduated from Union Theological Seminary in New York. And she felt a strong call to pastoral ministry. And she was in the Methodist tradition at the time. But her bishop told her quite plainly, there's absolutely no way you're going to get a job. Nobody is hiring a woman at this point to be in pastoral ministry. So she was angry and she was frustrated, and she was also not done with all the healing that she'd been working on since her parents had died when she was 16. So a Jesuit priest that was in New York City at the time, named Dan Sullivan. I'm sure there are many named Dan Sullivan, but this Dan Sullivan was also trained as a Gestalt therapist. And he offered 3 free Gestalt training to any seminarian. So she decided, well, I don't have anything else to do, I might as well take him up on it. So through this Gestalt process, which Gestalt is the German word that means, or has a meaning of wholeness. Am I right, Linda?
The whole picture.
The whole picture. Thank you. So this is a healing that involves the body as well, because emotions, as I'm sure Meg can tell you from her massage studies, are stored in the body. So it's been a very interesting learning, because it can often involve some pretty expressive outpouring of emotion in the healing process. But it is truly, sometimes, very quick and effective healing because it's so rooted in the body. So finding this tremendous healing working with Dan Sullivan, Tilda decided that she better get more training in Gestalt therapy, and why not, since no one would hire her as in pastoral ministry. At the same time, she began working as a chaplain for let me get the name right, a mental health institution in Staten Island. I believe it's called, South Beach Psychiatric Center on Staten Island. And she'd been having some very vivid dreams about healing. And so she thought, oh, what the heck, I'll try it. There was a psychotic patient on the floor who did nothing but talk in, I think it's called salad speech, which is actively sort of a babbling kind of speech, but it doesn't actually, the words don't make sense. So she thought, there's nothing to be lost here. I might as well try. It took her about a year, actually, to come to this place of sort of submitting to what these dreams were urging her toward. So she invited this inpatient into an office and he's nonstop. He's still doing his sort of babbling speech. She put her hand on the top of his head to pray for healing, a very simple prayer that he would be healed. And in that moment, he stopped his babbling. But she thought, well, it could be because my hand is on top of his head. So then ushered him out of the office and thanked him for his time, and he went on his way and she went on hers, and she was there a week later, and one of the chaplains called her into his office and said, what did you do to this guy? This man, over the course of a week, had stopped his babbling speech, his mind had become clear, and he was in the process of being, what's the word I want? Not dismissed. Discharged. Thank you. He was in the process of being discharged. And this scared her. But she began doing a little bit more healing prayer, and it became a significant part of her life. Moving on to Sister Mary's story. Sister Mary was a nun who had been a first grade teacher for many, many years. And Sister Mary was getting on in years, and her ankles had developed problems. And as you know, all the teachers in the congregation here, you're on your feet almost all the time. So for Sister Mary, this was a real challenge. Her ankles were swelling, they were very painful, and she knew there was a healing prayer group in her parish. But Sister Mary was very shy, and she did not fancy going in front of the healing group and having to tell her story. Bless you. That's part of my sermon. But she finally, the pain was getting bad enough and people were encouraging her. So she went. And she went to this healing prayer group and they prayed a very simple prayer over her. Well, this was also scary to her. They gathered around her, they put their hands on her ankles as they were praying for her. And nothing changed with her ankles, but surprise of surprises, an ear that had not been hearing well for most of her life since her childhood opened up. And the next week she went back, and her arthritis got a little bit better. in her shoulder. So she went back for, I think it was 16 weeks. And this is what happened. During this time, God was working marvelously with Mary in other ways. She became deeply aware that God loved her. Of course, Mary already knew this, and she had taught her first graders that God is love. I'm reading from the book now. But now, for the first time in her life, Mary felt God's passionate, tender love. God was no longer a demanding father ready with punishments if she did not work hard to please him, but one who delighted in her. As Jesus became more real to her as friend as well as Savior, Mary's shyness gradually diminished. She even found herself reading the Old Testament lesson at Sunday worship in front of hundreds of people, something she would not have dreamed of doing only a few months before. But here is the enigma. Mary still had painful ankles. They had only improved a little after months of prayer. One day she was asked why she thought the pain in her ankles persisted. She replied, "My ankles were the bait that enticed me to pray for healing in the first place. The continued pain kept me coming back so God would heal me in ways I didn't even know how to pray for. I couldn't have imagined the depth of this healing and how it involved so much of me. Just think of what I would have missed if my ankles had been healed that first night. God had something much more profound in mind for me than just my ankles." And her eyes twinkled and she smiled her wonderful smile, and she went on to talk about how she felt a new call to be a chaplain to some of the older sisters in her community who were in poor health. She was looking forward to developing a new ministry in that direction. So here are some things that Tilda and Robert Weber suggest Christian healing is not. Christian healing is not magic. It is not manipulating God to do what we want. Rather, it is surrendering to God's healing work in us. Christian faith for healing is not a prediction of what God will do. It is simple trust that God loves us and is at work in us already. And I have to tell you, I've learned this the hard way in things I've prayed for in work as a chaplain in the emergency room. Christian healing is not to be sought as a spiritual thrill for the healer or the person healed, which it can look like when we see the sort of far ends of that, the dramatic ways that people can be healed. Instead, it is a way to grow as a Christian for all involved. And lastly, Christian healing is not proof that we are faithful or holy, but it is a sign of God's love. Here's what it is. Christian healing is a process that involves the whole of our being: mind, body, emotion, spirit, and our social context. And it directs us toward becoming the person God is calling us to be at every stage of our living and our dying. Whenever we are truly open to God, some kind of healing takes place because God yearns to bring us wholeness. And in a way, the metaphor is like a stream that's running and it's got stuff blocking it. Healing is a way of simply getting things out of the way so that God's wholeness and God's love can run through us for our well-being and for the well-being of everyone around us. So I would like to say a little bit about pursuing this call to wholeness part of our call to wholeness is to allow bad feelings to surface, not to squash them down or to deny them because maybe they're not appropriate for prayer. Everything can be brought to prayer. And we will find that we can grow in our willingness to surrender plans, habits of behavior or thought, or are hanging on to things needing to happen in a particular way. We can be willing to be in scary or difficult situations, like asking somebody for forgiveness, or for the shy among us, of which I am one of those, doing this kind of thing. We can notice where we're rigid, and we can ask God to soften us. And if we find ourselves saying things like, I will never forget what he did to me, we can pray to be willing to give up such ideas. And although the healing process often involves our emotions, sometimes it begins with an act of will. Sometimes we need to be willing first. And if you're at all familiar with the 12-step program, you know that some of those big steps toward healing involve a whole step of first just being willing. Eventually, God will heal us when we strive to give all things over into God's hands. And as we continue to work on clearing this stream of obstacles to wholeness, it's important to remember the intricate connectedness of body, emotion, spirit, and mind. We can trust God to bring to the surface those things that are needing healing. We may not be always happy to see them, but we can trust God that when they arise, the time is okay, and God will care for us in that. That is more something, those principles apply to both individual healing, but I also want to urge us today to try on the idea of social healing. Social healing is the kind of thing that Mary was proclaiming in that Magnificat. She was proclaiming God's justice and God's actions on behalf of those who are oppressed in unjust societies. It is actually possible for us to pray for institutional healing, because sometimes it's not the individuals often within an institution. Sometimes it's actually sort of the path of the institution that grinds on sometimes in spite of the individuals within it. And we can be empowered to pray together in the name of Jesus Christ and declare something to be unjust, or to declare something to be against the way of God and needing of healing. And there are several stories in this book. Because as it turns out, George McLean, Tilda's husband, is a Methodist pastor who's been an activist for many, many years. And he gathered people together in New York when apartheid was a big issue and coming to focus in South Africa. And they prayed together. They denounced or renounced the power of apartheid in South Africa together. So it is possible for us also, and I sensed this last week when Mark was identifying some of the things that he longs to see change in, that we also can be brave and courageous enough to pray together for institutional or even societal healing, and to renounce injustice and oppression and profound unwelcome. And we can have the courage to do this together. And also as a church, we can gather to pray for healing for people together as a group. And this too is very powerful. So I would like to invite us to do a small experience of healing right now. And I just want us to experience it because there is something in the proclaimed word. And here's how it's going to go. There is a hymn, at least in the Methodist hymnal, and I I've looked to find it in ours, and it was familiar enough to me that maybe it is, but. And the last two words in the phrases in the chorus are, "This is a day of new beginnings. Our God is making all things new." It's actually in your little half-page bulletin. If you look where it says message and response. This is a day of new beginnings. Our God is making all things new. And this is what I'm going to invite us into. We need to take a moment to become aware of something that is troubling to us. Something that's a worry, something that's a grief, something that's a concern, but something that simply rises to awareness. Now I'm going to invite you to turn to your neighbor, and I'm going to ask you to take turns saying a sentence, just a sentence of that thing that troubles you. One person listens, one person speaks. And then the person who's listening will say these words that in a moment we're going to proclaim together. But we'll say, and you can use your bulletin as your cheat sheet, "This is a day of new beginnings. Our God is making all things new." And that's all you need to say. But make sure you look at your partner. Those of you who are sitting in families, if you would prefer not to talk to your family member, you may. But you may also do that. So before we do that, I invite us to proclaim together. This is a day of new beginnings. Our God is making all things new. Let's do that again. This is a day of new beginnings. Our God is making all things new. We are saying this with faith. Let's say it one more time. This is a day of new beginnings. Our God is making all things new. Now I invite you to find a person for a dyad and try the speaking of your concern and the listening.